Folk Tales Sketchbook.
There is one truth that every elder, every grandmother, and every ancient fire has been trying to tell you since the beginning of time, and it is simply this: the tighter you grip what you never earned, the more of yourself you lose in the holding. My name is Grandpa Nasuba, and tonight I am going to tell you about a raccoon who thought he was the smartest creature in the entire forest, who spent his days laughing at every honest worker he passed, and who eventually spent an entire night with his arm trapped inside a clay jar because he refused to let go of a single ear of corn. This story is older than your phone, wiser than your search history, and far more entertaining than anything you are about to watch next. The tale begins. This story takes place many generations ago, in the late season of a long and prosperous era when the tribe had grown strong, and the valley between the two forested hills had been their home for longer than the oldest elder could count backward, a time when the world moved at the pace of rivers and harvests, rather than the pace of rumours. The village stood at the centre of that valley, a well-tended and quietly confident place, close enough to the shimmering river that cold mornings carried the sound of moving water into the camp, and surrounded on three sides by cornfields. The people cultivated with genuine patience and seasonal care. They stored their harvest in tightly sealed clay jars and woven bags arranged at the shaded edge of the village beneath a wide oak tree. And they did not post a guard because it had never occurred to them that they needed one, which is the particular vulnerability of people who trust their neighbours and have never been given a reason to stop. Into this comfortable and well-ordered arrangement came Azeban the Raccoon, a creature of extraordinary talent applied almost entirely in the wrong direction. Azeban was small, fast, and magnificently self-satisfied, with a striped tail. He carried like a flag and dark rings around his eyes that gave him the permanent appearance of someone who had just gotten away with something significant. He passed the anthill every morning and called down his genuine condolences to the workers below, informing them at length that their dedication, while technically admirable, was ultimately a very scenic road to a very ordinary destination. He watched the beavers haul timber through cold water from first light until dusk, and shook his head slowly, the way a person shakes their head at a map that shows every road except the fast one. In Azeban's philosophy, which he had developed at great length while lying in a tree observing others' work, shortcuts were not laziness, but were the highest available expression of intelligence in any creature with a functioning mind, and he had committed to this belief with the full sincerity of someone who has never tested it against a real consequence. When the village fires burned down to coals, and the last footstep faded into silence, he came down from his branch and moved through the dark with the calm confidence of long practice. His fingers found the knots on the storage bags without hesitation. He helped himself to corn and smoked fish and dried berries at a comfortable pace, and he returned to the forest with a full belly and the quiet, unshakable certainty that his system was flawless and that the people of the village had no idea that anything was happening at all. The wise chief had not earned his title by being slow to observe what was directly in front of him. He had noticed the storage bags growing lighter across a stretch of nights when the weather had been dry. The forest animals were well fed, and there was no sensible reason for supplies to disappear on their own. And he drew his conclusions the way a skilled tracker draws conclusions from a trail, directly, without drama, and without announcing them to anyone. On the 7th night since the missing provisions first came to his attention, the chief did not sleep. He sat very still inside the granary, in the dark, and waited with the deliberate patience of a man who already understands how a story ends, and is simply allowing it the space to finish on its own terms. Azeban arrived at the usual hour, moving with the particular confidence of a creature who has never been caught, and has therefore decided that being caught is not something that happens to creatures like him. He worked his fingers into the sealed jar of dried corn with practiced ease, 2 handfuls deep and reaching for a third, when he became aware of breathing in the room that did not belong to him. He went completely still. The voice that came from the dark was steady and entirely unhurried, and it said, "You have remarkably fast hands for a creature with such strong opinions about the wastefulness of honest labour." Azeban did not run. Running would have been sensible, but Azeban had never valued sensibility when cleverness was available as an alternative. He turned slowly and faced the chief with an expression of complete composure, as though he had come here intentionally, and his presence was entirely legitimate. He reached into his pouch and withdrew a river pebble he had been carrying for several weeks, a water-smoothed stone that caught even the faintest available light and scattered it back in ways that looked, under the right circumstances, almost remarkable. "Chief," he said, with the warm and unhurried confidence of a creature who has talked his way out of worse situations than this, "you have found me at a moment of real significance, because I have been trying to locate you for 3 days." He held the stone up. "This is not an ordinary pebble. This is a star-blessed gem, given to me personally by the river spirit during the last full moon, and it holds within it the power to multiply any harvest it is placed near. I have been wrestling with my conscience all week about whether to share it with the tribe, and tonight my conscience finally won the argument." He set the stone in his palm and let it catch the light. "I am prepared to leave this gem with your people permanently, in fair exchange for a modest daily food portion, which would allow me to devote my full attention to the gem's care and the spirit's specific instructions." The chief looked at the stone in silence for a long moment. Then he looked at Azeban. Then he nodded, slowly, with an expression that Azeban interpreted as admiration, and that was, in fact, something else entirely. The chief's silence lasted long enough that Azeban began to feel the particular satisfaction of a performance that is going extremely well. He adjusted his posture slightly, tilted the pebble to a better angle, and let his expression settle into something he hoped conveyed the quiet dignity of a creature sharing genuinely important information. The chief, for his part, examined the stone with the focused consideration of a craftsman studying a piece of material before deciding what to make of it, which is exactly what he was doing, though not in the way Azeban understood. When he spoke, his voice was precisely as calm and even as it always was, which is its own kind of message for anyone paying the right quality of attention. A gem of such remarkable origin deserves a test equal to its power, the chief said. Legends must be verified rather than simply accepted on the strength of their own telling, because this tribe depends on what is real and not on what sounds promising. He held out both hands and received the pebble with a care that made Azeban feel genuinely respected, then returned it the same way, which is a gesture that carries meaning in any culture and that Azeban absorbed with uncomplicated pleasure. "Bring the gem to the shimmering river tomorrow night. We will hold a proper gathering, and if the power is as you describe, the river and the night air will confirm it in front of the full community. You are welcome to bring witnesses of your own choosing. The more who are present, the more the truth is honoured." Azeban looked at the chief for a moment, searching his face for the catch, and found nothing but the steady, open attention of a man with nothing to hide. He had arrived at the granary expecting either an immediate arrest or a quick agreement, and what he was being offered instead was an invitation to a ceremony, which felt like something considerably better than either of those outcomes. He thanked the chief with the warm and measured sincerity of a creature who has just received exactly what he came for, tucked the pebble back into his pouch, and stepped out into the cool night air, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He walked back into the forest, already calculating how the ceremony might be extended into a longer arrangement, something with more visibility and considerably more daily food. Behind him, in the quiet of the storage room, the chief remained still for a moment before he allowed himself a single, slow exhale. He had not agreed to any gem. He had agreed to a test. And tests, unlike bluffs, have only one outcome when properly designed. Azeban moved through the forest the following morning with the forward energy of a creature who has confused momentum for direction, which is one of the more costly confusions available in a world that will not slow down to correct it. He had spent the night revising his plans considerably upward, because the chief's invitation had opened a possibility that was significantly larger and considerably more reckless than his original scheme, which had only involved stealing enough food to avoid going hungry. Now he wanted followers. He wanted to arrive at the river the following night, not as a lone raccoon carrying a river pebble, but as a figure of standing, surrounded by a community of believers whose presence would lend the whole performance a weight and legitimacy that his silver tongue alone could not fully supply. He found the deer in a sunlit clearing and approached her with the warmth of a trusted friend, which he was not and had never pretended to be until that moment. "I have something important I want to share with you specifically," he said, "because I believe in being selective about who I bring into my confidence, and you have always struck me as a creature of real discernment." The deer looked up with wide, soft eyes and a genuine willingness to receive information kindly, which is a quality that has served deer well in most situations, and poorly in a few. Azeban described the star-blessed gem at length, catalogued its visual qualities with considerable embellishment, and explained that the chief of the human tribe had personally arranged a ceremony at the Shimmering River for the following night, at which the gem's power would be publicly demonstrated and the resulting abundance shared broadly across the forest community. He kept the details comfortable and unspecific, while making the rewards concrete and appealing, which is a formula that has supported a remarkable number of unfortunate decisions throughout history. And the deer agreed to come. He found the possum next, settled in a tree hollow with the quiet wariness of a creature accustomed to being overlooked, and told him a version of the story in which the possum's own intelligence had not gone unnoticed by someone of Azeban's particular perception, and that a creature of such genuine shrewdness deserved to witness a moment that most of the forest would only hear about second-hand. The possum, who had spent most of his life being underestimated by animals with less patience and fewer quiet observations, found this framing entirely persuasive. By the middle of the afternoon, Azeban had spoken privately to a rabbit, 2 squirrels, and a credulous young fox, and he had told each of them separately that they were among the small and carefully chosen group he had selected to trust. None of them knew about the others. All of them felt special. By evening he was back in his tree, listening to the forest settle into night, feeling something he took for leadership, which was in fact only the brief and hollow warmth of having distributed your own problem into several other creatures' Tuesday evenings. The night arrived cool and unusually clear, with enough stars overhead, that several of the animals commented on them as they made their way through the forest to the riverbank, which gave the gathering the atmosphere of an occasion even before anything had happened. The deer arrived first and stood close to the water with an air of quiet anticipation. The possum came shortly after, followed by the rabbit and the 2 squirrels walking in step, and then the young fox, who had mentioned the event to 2 additional animals, because he believed that was what you did when you had been personally selected to attend something historic. Azeban arrived last and deliberately, because he had decided over the course of the previous day that leaders arrive after the audience is already assembled, and has had a moment to feel the weight of waiting. He walked to the water's edge at a measured pace. He hoped communicated authority, held the pebble briefly in the starlight for the assembled animals, and received from the group a low and impressed murmur that he stored away as the most satisfying sound he had encountered in recent memory. Then the chief arrived from the tree line, accompanied by 2 younger members of the tribe, who carried between them a large clay jar with a narrow neck, a wide and heavy base, and a flat stone resting across its top. The jar released an aroma into the cool night air that preceded the chief by several steps and reached every animal present. Before the group had even finished settling, a deep and warm smell of roasted corn, that was the kind of smell that makes the stomach recall what hunger feels like, even when it is not currently experiencing it. The gathering went quiet, with an attentiveness that had not been there a moment before. The chief placed the jar down with deliberate care and addressed everyone present with the calm, unhurried authority of a person who has no need to raise his voice in order to be heard. "This jar holds the sacred corn of our harvest, prepared with care, and made available freely to any creature who can demonstrate the power of the gem that has been described to our tribe. He turned to look at Azeban with an expression that was perfectly even. The rule is this: the one who carried the gem drops it into the jar. If the power is real, the river will respond, and the one who placed the gem may reach inside and draw out their reward. Only the one who placed the gem may reach in. They may keep whatever they can hold in a single hand. Every animal turned toward Azeban. The pebble sat warm in his pouch. The corn smell sat warm in the air around him. And Azeban, who had never in his life walked away from something this close and this fragrant, stepped forward to the jar with the full confidence of a creature who has not yet understood what is about to happen to him. Azeban held the pebble up a final time for the assembled animals, turned it twice in the starlight, with the practiced showmanship of a creature who understood that presentation accounts for at least half of any successful deception, and then lowered it into the neck of the clay jar and released it. It settled among the corn kernels at the bottom with a quiet impact, and for one brief moment, everything was precisely as Azeban had arranged it, which was also the last moment that anything would be. He reached his arm down through the jar's neck, which accommodated his open forearm with little difficulty, and pushed his hand through the corn until his fingers found something solid and satisfyingly substantial. He closed his hand around a large ear of corn, as much as he could hold at once, and began to withdraw his arm with the measured calm of a creature accepting what is rightfully his. His arm did not come back through. The neck of the jar, which had been entirely cooperative on the way down, was presenting a different set of conditions on the return, because his closed fist, wrapped around the bulk of a full ear of corn, was considerably wider than the opening that had admitted his open hand without trouble. He pulled. He pulled again, harder. The jar shifted against the riverbank stones, but did not fall, because the chief had set it with the quiet foresight of a man who had designed this moment very carefully, and had no intention of letting physics undermine it. The animals watched with the particular silence of a group that is not certain whether what it is witnessing is an unexpected part of the planned performance. The chief, who had returned to stand at a respectful distance, spoke without raising his voice. "Open your hand, Azeban. Release the corn, and your arm will slide free. You can step back right now and walk away from this riverbank tonight." Azeban looked at the chief. He looked at the jar. He looked at the assembled animals who had followed him to this river on the specific promise of perpetual abundance, who were now watching him with expressions that were quietly and rapidly reorganizing themselves. He tightened his grip. He was not going to release that corn in front of this audience. He was not going to let go of the reward that stood at the center of a scheme. He had assembled and polished and carried all the way to this riverbank to complete. He pulled with both feet braced against the ground, and his entire body committed to the effort, and the jar moved 2 inches and stopped moving. The river continued its quiet passage beside him. The stars continued their indifferent arrangement overhead, and Azeban stood at the water's edge with his arm inside a clay jar and his fist, full of corn and the absolute refusal of a creature who had decided, somewhere in the course of a very long night, to mistake stubbornness for a form of courage. The hours that followed were not kind to Azeban, and they were not particularly compelling to watch, which is why most of the animals eventually sat down and stopped looking directly at him. The night grew steadily colder as it deepened, and the breeze moving off. The river had the particular sharpness of air that has been travelling a long distance across open ground and has gathered coldness from everything it passed. The chief had returned to the village after delivering his offer, leaving 2 younger tribe members to maintain a quiet and unhurried watch from a distance that was close enough to be attentive and far enough to be respectful. Azeban tried twisting his arm at different angles. He tried relaxing his grip by degrees, telling himself with some seriousness that he was adjusting his position rather than loosening his hold, which is the kind of logic that functions best when there are no witnesses and your arm is not inside a jar. He tried speaking to the situation in general terms, which produced no results. The deer watched him for a considerable stretch of time. with an expression that moved gradually from concern through confusion and arrived at something closer to quiet sadness. "Azeban," she said at last, in the careful tone of an animal choosing its words. "You could simply open your hand. The corn will still be there in the jar, and you could speak with the chief properly when morning comes." Azeban informed her, in a voice strained by effort and the cold, that she was not understanding the full strategic picture. Some time later, as the night reached its lowest temperature and the wind had been moving steadily across the bank long enough to dry everything it touched, the possum leaned forward and peered down through the narrow neck of the jar. The pebble, which had spent several hours sitting at the bottom of a dry clay container in moving cold air, had surrendered the moisture that had given it its glimmer. It was no longer smooth or reflective. It was pale and powdery, and looked precisely like what it had always been, which was a small and unremarkable piece of riverside rock. The possum straightened up and looked at the other animals. "It is just a stone," he said, and the silence that followed that observation was different in quality from all the silences that had come before it, because it had a conclusion sitting inside it. The deer rose without a word and walked into the dark. The rabbit followed. The two squirrels left together, and the young fox, who had personally vouched for this event to two animals who were now also standing up and looking at him, moved quickly in the direction of the trees before those two animals could finish forming a question. The clearing emptied in stages, the sounds of departure moving through the underbrush and fading, and Azeban was left alone beside the shimmering river in the dark, with a cold stone at the bottom of the jar in his arm, and nothing else nearby that bore him any goodwill. The first grey light of morning came over the eastern hill, the way it always does, without asking permission and without considering whether its timing is convenient. And it found Azeban exactly where the night had left him. He was sitting on the riverbank stones with the clay jar resting against his knee, his arm still inside it, and his fist still closed around the corn, with the kind of grip that had long since stopped being a decision and had simply become the shape his hand was locked into. He was cold, exhausted, and sitting in the particular silence of someone who has run out of arguments to make to himself. The two young tribe members who had maintained their quiet watch through the night had built a small fire at a distance, and at some point one of them had placed a folded blanket near enough for Azeban to reach it, which was more consideration than he had extended to anyone in a very long time. The chief arrived with the morning light, walking from the village at his unhurried and familiar pace, and sat down on a flat stone near the water. He looked at Azeban with an expression that held no performance, no satisfaction at another's difficulty, and no lecture waiting impatiently behind his eyes. He simply looked, with the quiet attention of a person allowing understanding to arrive at its own pace, rather than dragging it. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then the grip loosened. It did not release all at once. It came apart the way a person releases something they have been holding past all reason, gradually and in stages, one finger at a time, until the corn was no longer in Azeban's hand, but simply resting among the kernels at the bottom of the jar, and his arm came free with the strange weightlessness of a limb that had forgotten what it felt like to be unobstructed. He sat back and held his numb hand in his other hand, and looked at the river moving past him. The chief let the silence settle before he spoke, because the lesson was still arriving, and he understood better than to interrupt something in the process of becoming wisdom. You spent the entire night held in place by something you had not earned and refused to release, even when the way out was open and the cost of staying was plain. The gem was water and luck. The corn was not a reward but a question, and you answered it the same way every hour it was put to you. He paused, looking at the river. What you can offer from an open hand is the only measure of what you have truly earned. What you seize with a closed fist belongs to the grip, not to you. And when the grip fails, so does the treasure. Azeban looked at his empty hand for a long moment and said nothing, which was itself something new for him. Grandpa Nasuba leaned back from the campfire and looked at the people listening, because there are always people listening. And he said, I have watched a remarkable number of creatures put their hands into jars they could not get back out of. The jar keeps getting new names. Sometimes it is a scheme promising to triple your money by the end of the month. Sometimes it is a title at work you refuse to step back from long after it stops serving you. Sometimes it is an opinion you have carried so long that letting it go feels like losing a piece of your identity. The jar changes its shape and its label. The stuck fist looks identical every single time. Open your hand. What is genuinely worth keeping will still be there in the morning. And if it is not, then what you were holding was never the treasure. It was always just the jar. The moral of this story is that greed is not a strategy, but a trap a creature builds around itself without ever noticing the construction. Azeban was never imprisoned by the clay jar. He was imprisoned by his refusal to release what he had not earned and could not honestly keep. Every shortcut he chose was one step further into a situation that cleverness alone could not reverse, because the problem was never his circumstances, but the grip he would not loosen. The wisdom the chief offered was simple and complete. An open hand can receive, give, share, and grow, while a closed fist can only hold, and only for as long as the strength lasts. If this story made you think of a jar your own hand might currently be inside, that thought is the most valuable thing you will take from tonight's fire. Share this story with someone who needs it. Leave a comment telling us what you are choosing to let go of. Subscribe so Grandpa Nasuba can find you again, and come back whenever you are ready. The fire will be here.